Welcome to lecture number 10 of the lecture series History of English Literature. Today we have among us, as I informed you earlier also, a very young erudite scholar, Dr. Sovan Chakraborty. Sovan presently is an assistant professor in the Department of English, Patna Science College, Patna University, Bihar, India. Prior to joining to this particular post, he worked as a research scholar in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Roorkee. In 2017, he was awarded the DORA Plus Visiting Doctoral Fellowship, which is a part of URDF Erasmus Plus grants to the Department of Estonian and Comparative Folklore, Institute of Cultural Research and Arts, University of Taru, Estonia, Europe. He has served as a faculty member in a couple of technical and general degree institutions, both private and public. He has a very keen interest in the fields of folklore and oral narratives and has published a few research articles on Bengali folk ritual tales. Apart from this, his research interests and publications cover literatures of Indian modernity, Indian writing in English, and contemporary South Asian literatures. Some of his publications feature in internationally recognized journals indexed by Web of Science, Arts and Humanities Citation Index, Scopus, an European reference index for humanities, and are published by such globally acknowledged publishers such as Taylor and Francis, Routledge, John Benjamin's publishing company, Roman Brooks London, among others. This is his professional data, but as far as my association with Sovan goes back to long back, and what I can assure you, my dear friends, my dear participants, that we are in for a complete cerebral treat. So, without wasting much time, I would request the guest of our day, our resource person, Dr. Sovan Chakraborty, to please start his lecture. Dr. Sovan, the platform is all yours.
Yeah.
But before
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee, for such a nice introduction of mine. Good evening to uh, everybody who has joined all of us together this evening. And this is a proud privilege for me to present my little contribution to this on this platform. This is a very uh, appreciable initiative that Dr. Banerjee has taken, and I'm sure that this is going to help the student community of English literature a lot. And as I've been informed that this is basically for the students of graduation and post-graduation, I'll try to explain terms that appear in this presentation as clearly as possible. But yes, we have this discussion time at the end. If clarifications are sought, I'm ready to clarify things as far as possible uh, to the best of my ability. So with these words, thanking once again Dr. Banerjee, I'd like to begin with my presentation. The topic that has been given today is the turbulent 1890s, examining the avant-garde. Now, I would like to approach this presentation following the keywords that appear in the title. As far as my analysis of the title is concerned, there are 4 keywords in the title. The first is turbulent, the second is 1890s literatures, the word is understood here. Then examining or examination and avant-garde. I would rather like to start from the last keyword, avant-garde, which is the central, term in the whole presentation, because we are going to examine the avant-garde motifs, the avant-garde literatures that were seen during the period 1890s, chiefly in Britain and across the Europe for that matter. And why these literatures and these motifs present or represent something turbulent, that is something with which I'd like to conclude. So instead of starting from the left of the title, I'll start from the right of the title, starting with avant-garde, then the examination of avant-garde, and in between there will be 1890s, the period that we are talking about, the historical developments that took place, the literatures which were written during that period, and why is it turbulent, why the literatures represent something that is not at peace. That will be something with which I'll be concluding this lecture. So starting with avant-garde, what is avant-garde? So this slide is about approaching avant-garde. Now, avant-garde is a French term and a French military metaphor. A metaphor is something that stands for something else, which are not directly related. Now, advance-garde is the English translation of avant-garde in French, which is a military metaphor, means there is a small troop in the military system which keeps themselves forward to in comparison to others, and which basically start the ambush, means which attacks first, or which is the front line of any warfare for that matter. That is the troop which is most trained and which shows path to the rest of the members of the military troop. Taking up this military terminology into the literature, what we mean to say by avant-garde is, or advance-garde is, that a group of writers or literatures who show us the path to advance, to go forward, to build on whatever we have already done in the past, and to make new avenues through newer innovations and experimentations ahead of us. In the process, they challenge the impediments, like the soldiers in the front. They fight with several impediments that come on their way. Avant-garde or advance-garde or vanguard writers, they also challenge what is called in German Zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age, and they wish to change the system and try to make new avenues or paths for the coming generation to follow, and they wish to do this by experimenting with newer forms of literature, newer techniques of writings. So, in the process, another thing that takes place is that they very often are cut off from the majority of the people, rather the majoritarian beliefs or faith systems, and this is called alienation. They get alienated from the majority or majoritarian views in order to make something new. So, make it new, Ezra Pound's famous phrase, that is quite important in this context. This is avant-garde is a phenomena which is at once, at the same time, individualistic, because the writers who are showing us new paths, who are experimenting, they are very often doing this on individual levels with individual thoughts and techniques. So this is surely individualistic, but at the same time, this also represents a group spirit. This is not sheerly individualistic. This is also a representation of the thought processes, belief systems, and techniques of small self-conscious group of artists and authors who deliberately undertake, in Ezra Pound's phrase, to make it new. So make it new, cutting off from the previous conventions or the majoritarian conventions of the age, and to go forward in search of newer avenues through innovations. That is what is important as far as understanding of avant-garde is important, is concerned. So, as I have already told you, that in violation of the accepted conventions and proprieties, not only about art but also of social discourse, they set out to create ever new. This I have already explained. They come up with new artistic forms and styles and introduce hitherto neglected and sometimes forbidden subject matter. They represent themselves as alienated from the established order, cut off from the established order, against which they assert their own autonomy. Autonomy is also important because when you think in a new way, in your own way, then you have to pave a path for yourself. So, in that process, many a times you get cut off from the majoritarian or mainstream trends, and also the only way to go forward that remains with you is to assert your own self, assert your own autonomy. So it is also true for the avant-garde artists, and their aim is to shock the sensibilities of the conventional reader and to challenge the norms and pieties of the dominant bourgeois culture. Now, here comes another important term, that is bourgeois culture. What is bourgeois culture? Bourgeois culture is a kind of elitist culture confined within a small group of people who are generally considered, as far as traditional Marxism is concerned, as economically rich. So, economically rich people creating autonomous or creating norms for majoritarian views, that becomes dominant case in an age, that group is called bourgeois. It is a Marxist term which posits itself in opposition to the term called proletariat or the working class people. So, bourgeois culture is the culture of the elite and rich. But in terms of thinking about avant-garde, this is also true that in process of becoming more and more unconventional, anti-establishment and autonomous, many writers and authors, even if they did not become economically rich, they became culturally bourgeois. So they eventually became a part of the established bourgeois culture as well. So there is this tension that I try to or like to, address in this lecture as well in coming slides, that avant-garde is primarily about challenging the accepted norms, breaking the rules, or breaking the norms of the zeitgeist or the spirit of the age. But it's also about getting absorbed when it becomes mainstream in the coming future. So whether it will continue to remain avant-garde or it will be absorbed by the mainstream, that is the dialectics or the tension that goes on as far as avant-garde literatures are concerned. Now, how do cultures across the Neo-Latin space, or in simpler words, different parts of Europe? That is quite interesting. This is especially interesting because how this term avant-garde has been interpreted in different cultures, Neo-Latin cultures. Neo-Latin means the cultures that have origin in Latin, but have eventually evolved their own languages and cultural prototypes. So Neo-Latin cultures or European cultures, like in Spanish, as far as Guillermo de Torre is concerned, he means that avant-garde means a kind of book or a written document that studies many movements or aspects of literary radicalisms. So radical or against the norms, or one that challenges the established forms and norms. So that is avant-garde. Josh Ortega y Gasset interprets it as dehumanized art, abstract art, the new or young art. In French and Italian cultures, this is interpreted as theoretical problems in aesthetics and also a view on art and culture depending on social disposition, whether a work of art is addressing social concerns in positive way or in a negative way. That is how French and Italian cultures, they look at this. The Germans connect it with modernism, or a style that is regarded as modern, but also as decadence or cessation. So avant-garde is also associated with decadence or socio-cultural moral degeneration as far as the treatment of the term in Germany is concerned. It is also treated as new romantic, revival of romantic spirit. The romantic means the spirit of romance, the spirit of adventure, the spirit of finding the unknown, finding out the unknown, the spirit of imagination, the spirit of breaking the shackles. So all these new romantic traits or traits of romance, they come back with the advent of the avant-garde literatures. Russian, with in Russian culture, as far as its Marxist orientation is concerned, it is the avant-garde term treated as radical, sociological, or in Marxist terms, and then it is dominantly imagined and treated as bourgeois art or bourgeois literature or bourgeois bohemianism. Bohemianism is a spirit which seeks not to have a steadfast root, a home, the spirit of a wanderer, that is bohemianism with extreme form of free thinking and free action. So they do it, Russians connect it with this bourgeois, means elitist, free action and free thinking movement. And in the British, it's treated as vanguard. The British variant will be, discussing in coming pages. And literary and artistic advance guard, or thinking in advance of the age, as far as literature or arts are concerned. So that is how the British, consider about the term, considered the term. Now, this term, for the first time, appeared in Henry de Saint-Simon's writing, that is Literary, Philosophical, and Industrial Opinions, in 1825, where this, where from this excerpt is taken, and this is a representative quotation taken from Saint Simon to show how in 1825 this term was treated by Saint Simon. And I quote, "We artists will serve you as an avant-garde. The power of arts is most immediate. When we want to spread new ideas, we inscribe them on marble or canvas. What a magnificent destiny for the arts is that of exercising a positive power over society, a true priestly function, and of marching in the van, that is vanguard, of all the intellectual faculties." If this quotation seems a little bit complex to some people, I'd like to ask them not to worry about. We will try to find out the keywords from this quotation. The first is, it's about artists who will serve you as an avant-garde. What is avant-garde? Saint Simon describes it in terms of, first, a religious faith, and second, in terms of military metaphor. The first is priestly function. The priests who do all kinds of rituals for our well-being and especially well-being in coming future. So in the coming days, if we treat this as a religious metaphor or religious terminology, then what priests do for us, that theological definition is there, or interpretation is there, or implication is there in Saint Simon's 1825 definition of our God, that we are kind of theologically or kind of divine or semi-divine people who show you the path in unknown future. And secondly, we are also army, part and parcel of an army which is marching ahead of the society of the majority to break all the barriers that come in the way and to pave new ways, new paths for the entire society. And that is not done, you know, through guns, but with pains. So this is this is done with their intellectual and artistic faculties. So this is a definition that almost points out to how avant-garde is accepted in nowadays. Going to the next definition, that is after 20 years by Gabriel Desire Lavernath, he also defines avant-garde in these terms in his writing on the mission of art and the role of artists. When he is defining the role of artists in 1845, he says, he rather uses this term here in this quotation. He says, art, the expression of society, manifests in its highest soaring the most advanced social tendencies. So art is something very special. Art is not something that society can afford to treat in derogatory terms. Art is rather something which is the highest virtue of the society, highest asset which is there to a society, and which you know which shows the most advanced social tendencies. It is the forerunner and the revealer. So once again, the vanguardism or going ahead of the age and paving new avenues, that is there when he says forerunner and revealer. And revealer, when he says revealer, revealer is once again a semi-theological term, which is like they are revealing something in front of you. You could not see that, but we as artists, we could see that, and we reveal it to you. So this revelation is related to something that can be treated as semi-divinity, semi-divine. Therefore, to know whether art worthily fulfills its proper mission as initiator, art is something that initiates. Whether artist is truly of the avant-garde, one must know where humanity is going. If so, for an avant-garde artist, it is important to foresee. So once again, a semi-theological divine term uh, is being imagined or is being considered for an avant-garde artist, who must be a seer, who should foresee where humanity or the society is going and know what the destiny of human race. So futuristic. Avant-garde is always about future. This is why there is the challenge with the present age. This is why there is the alienation or cutting off from the present age. Along with now this is very important, an additional interpretation or characteristic that is given here. Along with the hymn of to happiness, the dolorous and despairing ode to lay bare, this is very important, to lay bare with a brutal brush all the brutalities, all the filth which are at the base of our society. So, avant-garde, although it runs ahead of the society, it is deeply rooted in the society. And it must take up the action of cleansing, of purgation, of social evils. So, not only an avant-garde artist is a forerunner, a seer, but also he is a cleanser. He, he or she must be able to cleanse the evils of the society. And this is why very often stark realism is becomes a part and parcel of avant-garde literature. But I've already told you that tension is always there as far as avant-gardism is concerned. And on one hand, there will be romanticism, romance, the tendencies related to romance in avant-gardism. But on the other hand, there will be stark realism as well. So this is where we find out that people are talking about both of these tendencies. This is why I, basically show you these two quotations. Now, coming to the next slide, now I'll be talking about two kinds of avant-gardes. One is political and the second is aesthetic. And this is also about a historical progress of avant-gardism as a movement. Until 1870s, avant-garde didn't have an interpretation, an implication, or a connotation outside the political literature. In starting from 1870s, although it was introduced in 1825, but until 1870s, the chief tendency associated with avant-gardism or avant-garde as a movement was basically political, was basically related to radical left-wing politics. And in the same sense, Baudelaire, Charles Baudelaire, when he uses the term littérature d'avant-garde, I'm sorry for my pronunciation, or the literateurs or writers of the avant-garde, in his personal notebook during 1862 to 1864, is called My Heart Laid Bare and Other Texts. He also senses avant-garde or implies avant-garde as writers who are ideologically on the left, or the radical writers for that matter. But this all changed when two historical developments took place. The first is Franco-Prussian War or Prussian War in 1870, 1871, and the revolt and repression of the Commune in 1871. The Commune started, or the revolt against the established French establishment that started in 1870 and that concluded in 1871. So 1870-71, these two historical developments that led to, or that rather transported this political avant-gardism as a political idea to the field of literatures and arts. So before 1870-71, it was basically political and with so associated with the political radicalism or activism. But from 1871 onwards, roughly, the secondary strain that was there in avant-gardism, that is the art the implication of avant-gardism in arts and aesthetics, that became the mainstream from 1871 onwards. So we can see that during commune, means in 1870, in 1871, we can see the coexistence of both of these kinds of avant-gardes. First is political and the second is aesthetic. Two famous avant-gardist poets, first is Arthur Rimbaud and the second is Paul Verlaine. Both of them were avant-gardes, but were of different kinds, roughly. I mean, so whereas Rimbaud actually carried weapons for political activism, Verlaine wrote poetry and was accused of having communard sympathies or sympathies for communism. So the first was predominantly, in Rimbaud's case, it was predominantly political, whereas in Verlaine's case, it was primarily poetical or artistic or aesthetic. But they both coexisted during Commune or 1870-71. After Commune, one more thing that was added to this thing, avant-gardism, that artists who were earlier associated with communism and the commune uprising, they, after the failure of the commune, resorted to some extent anarchy, socialism, and radical anti-establishment artistic activities, primarily artistic activities. So they were plebeian, they primarily belonged to the lower strata of the society, or at least they were culturally regarded as belonging to the lower strata of the society. And bohemianism, once again, extreme free thinking and action, extreme rootlessness, that was then the characteristic of Paris. The commune took place in Paris primarily. So decadence or degeneration, as per the then moral standards of the Victorian period or age, they were doing something that was a sign of degeneration. So decadence, this was also become associated with avant-garde movement. When the first literary little magazine, the Independent Review, was introduced in the literary circle for the first time in 1880, in that magazine as well, we can see the coexistence of these two kinds of avant-gardes, because both of these politically active and aesthetically predominant branches of avant-garde published with this magazine, the Independent Review. Basically, the literary or artistic avant-gardism became the primary avant-gardism in post 1880s, where two advanced opinion holders or two avant-gardes, kinds of avant-gardes, they parted their ways, and the more action oriented political avant-garde, that took a backseat, and the more metaphorical or figurative avant-garde, that became the mainstream as far as avant-gardism is concerned. And what is more important, we were talking about whether avant-garde could remain avant-garde in spirit, whether avant-garde became as radical as it was in the initial days after its exposition to the market economy. That also became a part and parcel of the avant-garde thinking pattern, at least, or criticism on avant-garde, at least. So gradually in post 1880s period, avant-garde was also to some extent engulfed by the market and became cliche symbols of exchange currency. We started buying radicalism or artistic radicalism in the name of avant-gardism. Like museums bought avant-garde or radical portrayals or pictures painted by avant-garde artists. But gradually, when people started, you know, uh, visiting museums, reselling took place. All these things, they kind of made avant-garde a kind of cliche movement, or maybe a cliche kind of thinking was also introduced with the avant-gardism. So that happened in post 1880s, and primarily avant-gardism or the thinking of avant-gardism became confined in within the sphere of arts and literatures. So now two kinds of theoretical thinkings that were developed by on avant-garde by Pogioli Renato, and later on by Peter Barger will be discussing, but I think the time is not there with us, and we should, you know, come to 1890s fast. So in very brief, I'd like to tell you how theoretical discussions about avant-gardism uh, were made by these two leading theorists on avant-garde literatures or arts for that matter. In the theory of avant-garde, which was published in 1968, Pogioli Renato has, you know, approached avant-gardism as a dialectic or a tension between oppositional ideas. In his book, The Theory of the Avant-Garde, on one hand, Renato talks about the activism or antagonism that was there in the avant-garde movement, which is much more political and external, relatively political and external. And the second was physical, and the second was nihilism or agonism, which both of these were psychological symptoms of avant-gardism, more innate and related to the psychological dispositions of the avant-garde artists, much more inner, much more psychological than than in the outer sphere or than in the physical sphere. So these kinds or the characteristics of avant-gardism, Renato calls as or terms as moments. So there are four moments by Pogioli Renato as far as avant-gardism is concerned. The first is activism, which is like a tendency of certain individuals, parties, or groups to act without heeding plans or programs, to function with any method, including terrorism and direct action, for the mere sake of doing something and of changing the socio-political system in whatever way they can. So Renato tells us that for the sake of changing the socio-political systems, some avant-garde artists, they took resort to actions, artistic actions, literary actions, but actions without any, plan in their hand. So spontaneity and action orientedness, these two characteristics are highlighted by activism as far as the interpretation by Pogiolo Renato is concerned. Here he is giving us the example of a Russian futurist, Mayakovsky, who writes, painter will try to evoke a cavalry charge with a barbed wire of subtle lines. So an artist will definitely create subtle lines in paintings, but through those lines, he or she will have to perform a military task, a military task of ambushing, of attacking the social or the majoritarian conventions. So a cavalry charge they must undertake with a barbed wire to cut it across and to advance forward. So this kind of military activism that is there associated with this moment of avant-garde. Now comes the second thing, antagonism. Whenever you are taking an action, you should take an action against somebody. Otherwise, you can't take an action at all. Every action of us is taken in favor of somebody and against somebody. If the action is not very subtle and very balance oriented, so antagonisms were part and parcel of avant-garde activism, and there were two antagonisms. First was against the public, against the mass culture and taste, and the second was towards tradition. So avant-garde artists in the second moment tried to protest against or go against and take action against two groups. The first is mass and the second is tradition. This is why the term decadence or degeneration also got associated with them, when they went to such an extreme that they went out of control of all kinds of received traditions in the society. And the second was they got alienated or cut off from the majoritarian dispositions of the society because they were also against the public taste. So these two antagonisms make the second moment for Renato. The third moment is the first of the psychological moment or psychological character of avant-garde or inner characteristic of avant-garde. The first is nihilism. Nihilism is what? The essence of nihilism, Renato writes, lies in attaining non-action by acting, lies in destructive, not constructive labor. So when they goes to such an extreme that they also started harming themselves, their psychological balance and disposition as well. So when it became a destructive labor or agent or power instead of a constructive agent, that became the third moment of avant-garde called nihilism. The fourth was agonism. This is once again internal or psychological trait, and the fourth moment in Renato. Renato's interpretation of avant-garde. Agonism is a Greek portmanteau or conjoining of two Greek words. One is agon, which is activism, and agonia, which is tragic sense of life. So if we join these two tragic, these two Greek terms, first is agon or activism, the second is tragic sense of life, agonia. Then what we derive is that by taking action, we are actually proceeding to the tragic end, towards the tragic end, or towards a tragic result in life and society. So when this tragedy takes place in life and society and in psychology of the writers and artists, then that became the fourth moment for Renato, which is agonism. Agonism means tension, the pathos of ultimate spasm to make his own suffering immortal and fecund. So artist when goes to that extreme as to suffer himself or herself, destroy himself or herself, and become immortal, with a view of becoming immortal, then it becomes something, kind of a inner character trait for that artist. So that's what happens in the fourth moment of avant-garde by Renato. Coming to the Peter Barger's theory of avant-garde, uh, in the book of the same name, published in 1974, we can see that when Renato is approaching avant-garde, he is approaching it as a movement which started with Romanticism and which is a recurring motif in every culture, literature, and art of every other age in future. So it is an ongoing process. But when Peter Barger interprets avant-garde, he does it by seeing it as something that started with the avant-garde movements in 1920s, 30s, like Dadaism, Surrealism, which are different kinds of avant-garde artistic movements that took place in 1920s and 30s. But then that avant-garde he interprets also ended with the conclusion of these movements, or the conclusion of the relevance of these movements. So on this, the tension that we were talking about, the dialectics that we were talking about, whether avant-garde is a recurring motive, is an ongoing process, or avant-garde was already absorbed by the mainstream and it lost its relevance, that becomes very important when we see, or when we put side by side these two theories, one by Renato and the second by Barger. Renato sees it as an ongoing process, whereas Barger sees it as something which started with such high avant-garde movements as Dadaism, Surrealism, Stalinism, etc., and also concluded with them. So in his opinion, today there is no avant-garde in our arts and literatures, whereas Renato considers that there is still avant-gardism present in today's arts and literatures. So why did Barger tell us that the avant-garde is no more with us, and it concluded with Dadaism, Surrealism, etc.? Because he sees that avant-garde as a movement got completely detached from the public, from the mass, from the life at large, and its adherence to ideologies that also, you know, was that also contributed to its conclusion. So he says, Barger says that we need to reintegrate avant-gardism with life at larger if we want to relive the moments of avant-gardism even today. Otherwise, it is gone forever. And here, an important distinction is made by him between modernism and avant-gardism. He says that modernism is the aesthetic autonomy of art, whereas avant-garde should be political sharpness to reconnect with life at large. So modernism was largely autonomous, or should have been, or remained autonomous, alienated, but avant-garde as a movement should have retained that political sharpness so that connect with it could connect with life at large. Modernism could be engulfed by the market, but avant-garde should have never been engulfed by the mainstream or the market for that matter. So at this moment we must keep in mind that we are talking about avant-garde and its initial characteristics or moments during 1890s, and not its full-fledged uh, experience in the 1920s and 1930s, or maybe in 1940s to some extent. So we will discuss the chief characteristics or character traits of avant-gardism in 1890s. But anyways, these characteristics or character traits, they were carried forward in to or into 1920s and 90s, 1930s literatures, avant-garde movements as well. So here are three phases of art history that Peter Berger says how avant-garde artistic as an artistic movement, how avant-garde become a movement from the bourgeois art. So he says that in the beginning it was sacral art or sacred art forms generated in churches. The production was by anonymous or unknown artists, but reception was collective. Everybody could see a painting in the church. Everybody could relate to the theological story associated with that art painted on the walls of a church. But who painted it? It was not known. So artists were anonymous, but the reception was collective. In courtly art, in king's courts, they represented, the artists were known, and they produced artworks with the purpose of representing the court or the kings and the queens. The production was individual, but the reception was still collective. It was received in almost the same prescribed manner across the kingdom. But with the advent of bourgeois art, art's production became individualistic It insisted on the bourgeois self-understanding. It became more and more individualistic, and the reception also largely became individualistic in the sense that the artist could be understood but by a very little very little number of people or experts, or they could be interpreted in various ways by various people, but at least the non-trained masses, they could not connect with those arts. So the elitism and the alienation or cutting off from the mass, that became the part and parcel of bourgeois art, which handed over the baton to the avant-garde in the 1880s, 1890s. When in avant-garde as a movement took place, and both the characteristics of elitism and also an attack of against this elitism, that became part and parcel of the avant-garde movement. Art became autonomous in avant-gardism in initial days that we are talking about in 1890s literatures and arts, but at the same time it arts became part of social nexus, because finally the point that was raised by Peter Berger was that these artists and their arts, they were also production of the social larger social consciousness, so part of society as well, but autonomy also became a hallmark of avant-garde movement. So this there lies the tension between the opposite poles. One is towards autonomy, one is towards the other, that is larger masses, societal norms, the production by the society, etc., etc. So this is how Peter Berger and Renato, they are different in their views on avant-garde. We will take up both of these views and will treat it as tension in the avant-garde movements for that matter, which actually creates the term or creates an interpretation for the term turbulence in our title. This tension, whether it is for the society, whether it is against the society, whether it is following the conventional norms, whether it's not following, whether it's militating against that, whether it's against the spirit of the age, or whether it is produced by the spirit of the age, this tension goes on as we talk about the avant-gardism in 1890s, and that produces the turbulence in the literatures of 1890s. I'm not going into these quotes anymore because time is short. What, in a nutshell, this present quotation tries to convey is how bourgeois art became absorbed and by the market and the majority and became commercialized. So this, is shows a point in like Christopher Caldwell makes a point in Studies in a Dying Culture, that avant-gardism is, it's possible that avant-gardism is over, it has been absorbed and commercialized, so the sharp political antagonism and activism, the first two moments of Renato, that are gone. But if we come to this quotation, we can see it as a recurrent motif. It is still with us. Avant-gardism and the literature of 1890s, they are still with us. Especially, please try to concentrate on the second part of this quotation, uh, of the first sentence rather, when where Sanders say or writes that all of which means these character traits like consumerism, domestic stability, imperial expansion, all these characteristics makes them sound more like us than they did 20 years ago. So he's telling us, writing, Sanders writing in 2007 means like 13 years ago, that the avant-gardism that took place in 1890s, that is almost 120, 30 years ago, that seems to be a movement which is still staying with us at least till 2007, when Sanders was writing this, and we believe that it's still with us as well. So when Davison writes it, it became all the more clear whether the characters who populate the fictional worlds of the 19th century Britain and her colonies are really mirrors of ourselves is a moot point. But it is not unusual to see some authors and their texts, such as Bram Stoker's Dracula or Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, sold as being of their time, that is in 1890s, but also as works which speak to the anxieties, desires of the 20th and the 21st century. So we are the product of 21st century, and we still feel the same kinds of anxieties, desires that were shown or depicted in the literatures of 1890s. And that is the relevance, that is the fineness, that is the marvel that lies in the literatures of 1890s. And this is why probably the avant-gardist movement that started with uh, the, the artists and literatures of 1890s, that you know uh, placed the foundation stone for modernism, and I think even postmodernism in 19 post 1950s 60s, and even post theoretical positions that we take in today's times, post theory. So the forefathers were these, avant-gardists of 1890s. So although Peter Barger talks about the differentiation between modernism and avant-gardism, we find a stark, at least I find, a stark parallelism of modernity, which is a recurrent motif of being modern. Like in 20 in 14th 15th century, something was modern in their times. Like today, modern is something that is in that is new to us. But tomorrow or after a decade, it will be old and cliche. It will no more remain modern. So modernity is a recurring structure. Whereas modernism is a particular elitist movement in arts and literatures, as far as autonomy of these writings and paintings are concerned, that took place in 1920s, 30s, 40s even. So modernism, even if it is confined to that period, modernity is a recurrent structure. So when we think of avant-garde's contemporaneity, we should also think parallelly of the tension of old and new that is there in the recurrent structure of modernity. And when we look at, I'll go back a slide, and when we look at this uh, phenomenal definition of modernity by Charles Baudelaire in The Painter of Modern Life in 1964, we see that how the tension of this old and new is both is the part and parcel of both the movements or the mm, incidences called avant-garde and modernity. Baudelaire says that modernity is transient, the fleeting, the contingent. It also it always passes by. It creates something new this moment and becomes old the other moment, the next moment. It is one half of the art, the transience, the fleeting nature of modernity, the contingent now nature of modernity is one half of the art, and the other being the eternal and immovable. There is something that is universal in art as well. So, modernity is torn between the new and the old, between the contingent, the now, the changeable, and the universal, the immovable. And the same dialectics or the same tension between oppositional poles that is seen in avant-garde as well. And we have so far discussed this tension through different definitions and theoretical formulations by leading theorists of avant-garde so far. So now it's time to take a look at the reference points or the parameters on which we are going to examine avant-garde literatures, mainly English literatures or British literatures to be more specific, produced in 1890s. So what are the parameters? What are the reference points on which we'll examine these literatures? What should be the characteristic features that should be reflected in easier words, that should be reflected in the words that we will mention now in the coming phase of our lecture? So the reference points or the parameters that we derive from all these discussions, both theoretical, the historical development of avant-garde, and also the definition, commonplace definition of avant-garde. These are the characteristics or parameters that we derive for examining avant-garde movement. First is small grouping of artists and writers who have some common ideological lines, and that is basically aligned, the ideology is basically aligned to the left or the radical ideologies. The motto was to change the society and the culture or the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist. They will go for innovation and experimentation. They will mostly be anti-establishment and anti-foundational. Now, anti-establishment is one thing, against the majoritarian views or notions or actions, against the establishment or the ruling order. But sometimes when we talk about decadence, then we find this characteristic of anti-foundational. They will not at all believe in any foundation for that matter, any rooted system of belief for that matter. And they think that this is the radicalism proper, because the moment we root ourselves in some faith or belief system or ideology or in action, then the moment we become static, the moment we become cliche, and the sharp political power of avant-garde is gone. So when we talk about bohemianism or nihilism of or in avant-garde literatures, then we find not only anti-establishment traits but also anti-foundational, absolute rootlessness, tendency of being rootlessness or remaining rootlessness. So that is there also in there, in the avant-garde literatures. Alienation or cutting off from the majority, or the dominant tendencies of the age, that is also there. Both externally activist and internally agonist. We have all discussed this in the moments defined by Renato. Now, these points are all addressing the tension that remains in an avant-garde movement. Both that can be activist, externally, and internally agonist. May both be realist when they want to brutally brush the social evils. We found these phrases in earlier definitions. Brutally brush aside the cruelties and the social evils of the dominant age, the dominant establishment of the age. So that will be realist, but at the same time, we will show an escapist tendency, an idealist tendency as well, that will be romanticist. This will primarily begin as anti-elitist, but will eventually be absorbed by the cult of the highbrow, or the cult of bourgeois elitism. So basically, this is dialectical or full of tension between opposite poles, but also dynamic, keeps on going forward. Both break with the social norms, the thinking pattern, the structure, the establishment, but also continuity, because they are produced by those cultures, produced by those establishments as well. On the one hand, that they are autonomous and try to be independent, but they cannot escape the cultural appropriation by the cultures and the political establishments that come or that follow after the production is over. So these are the parameters or characteristics in an easier term of the avant-garde, on which we'll try to examine the literatures of 1890s. But before we move into the examination, briefly we try to look at what are the historical conditions or developments that somehow necessitated a movement like avant-garde, or that became that provided a platform for avant-garde movement to grow in 1890s. So here are some major historical developments that took place in 1890s In 1891, Education Act provided free elementary education to all and sundry. 1893 is very important when Second Irish Home Rule Bill defeated. Still, colonialism goes on. 1893, the Independent Labour Party is founded. Mind it, this is not Labour Party of today's England or UK or the UK. This is the Independent Labour Party that was founded in 1893, before, even before the establishment of the today's Labour Party in 1900. So, and under the banner of the Independent Labour Party, for the first time in a formal way, the proletariats or the working class people and their ideologues, they came together. In 1893 also, the Married Women's Property Act that was passed as well, which gave the wives or the married women some rights over the property in the spirit, in the same spirit or at par with the unmarried women as well. So that facilitated some of the upper class ease and leisure in writing, in taking resort to various kinds of activism. 1899, Boer War against Dutch South Africans that took place. 1900, very important, Labour Party under Ramsay MacDonald's Labour Representation Committee that was founded. And in 1901, Queen Victoria dies, and Edward VII took to the throne. So these are the major historical events that took place. Now I'm coming to the implications of four of the major movements here. Education Act provided elementary education that resulted in widespread education in the masses. So masses became more conscious of their rights. Masses became more aware of the of the inequality in the social order or the oppressive structures of the society, and they started protesting against. So which become a part and parcel of the avant-garde movement. The establishment of the Independent Labour Party in 1800 and Labour Party in 1900 that gave a platform, not only gave provided a platform to the so-called oppressed people and the left ideologues for the first time, but also had leveling effects on the growing economic inequality of the days. We do not have much time to ponder over these historical factors at length, but almost 1/5 of the wealth by the end of this century belonged to the 4/5 of the property or wealth that belonged to the 1/5 of the population during that time. So today we talk about economic inequality, and we talk about a few people, basically industrial tycoons. They are in possession of the most of the wealth of the world. This was the situation in towards the end of the 19th century as well, when 4/5 of the wealth went to the hand of 1/5 of the population, at least as far as the UK was concerned. So this growing economic inequality had to some extent countered by the establishment of these parties, left parties. And Westminster Review became, which was in any case founded in 1820, became the mouthpiece of these parties, if not very formally, then informally for sure. Uh, and they started, taking out the writings and paintings by the left ideologues towards the turn of the century. The Married Women's Property Act allowed some rights to married women at par with the unmarried women, but this was limited. Uh, uh, this gave this provided some leisure to the women of the upper class, whereas the middle and lower class women largely remained unaffected by this reformation. Now, literary productions in 1890s, I will not read out each and every literature published in 1890s, but it's up to, I'll pause for a moment, and you can for yourself look at these publications in 1890s. Some major publications are Walter Pater's Appreciations in 1890, which talked about the aesthetic, which carried forward rather the aesthetic movement in arts specifically, and literatures also, that was a phenomenon of an earlier age in the Victorian period, although, but it was a phenomenon of the earlier phase. So in 1860s, 70s, this aesthetic movement was going on. So it resulted in a particular form of aestheticism that Peter talked about, talked in appreciations in the 1890s for that matter. This is why this is important. James Fraser's Golden Bough is very important because the way the traditional treasures and folk motifs, etc., etc., they were collected in James Fraser's Golden Bough. That was important as far as the development of folklore and anthropology is concerned, as disciplines are concerned. Morris wrote News from Nowhere. Hedda Gabler is very important from the feminist point of view, or the point of view of the emergence of new women. Thomas Hardy's Days of the D'Urbervilles, the last but one novel, the second last novel, that published in 1891. The Picture of Dorian Gray, also was published in 1891. The first volume of Sherlock Holmes, The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes, came out in 1892. And George Bernard Shaw's Mrs. Warren's Profession, a realistic problem play dealing with the women question as well, came out in 1893. 1894, Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book came out, which at least indirectly took directly to the issue of both, I think, colonial margins and also eco-critical consciousness. Then G.B. Shaw's Arms and the Man, that was published in 1894. 1894 to 1897, the Yellow Book, a periodical that was very important because it contained many important writings related to aesthetic and decadent movements associated with avant-gardism of 1890s. They were published in this periodical called the Yellow Book. Then once again, 1894, very important from the perspective of the women question and the emergence of new women. It was basically associated with an essay written by Sarah Grant in the North American Review, and the essay was titled "The New Aspect of the Women Question." The new aspect of the women question. So, so this also took place in 1895. Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure, L.G. Wells' Time Machine, Oscar Wilde's An Ideal Husband, and The Importance of Being Earnest. Both of them, took place. Got published. Joseph Conrad's The Nigger of the Narcissus was published in 1897. G.B. Shaw's Candida and Thomas Hardy's Wessex Poems was published in 1898. 1900 saw the publication of Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim, and 1901 Rudyard Kipling's Scheme came out. Thomas Hardy's Poems of the Past and the Present, that came out in 1901. So this is a list, a rough list of the major literary publications that took place in 1890s. Now, I try to examine the avant-garde as reflected in the literatures written in 1890s through some ideas and vis-a-vis some texts that were either written or published during 1890s. The first is socialism and utopianism, which remained an important characteristic of avant-garde movement in 1890s. News from Nowhere was written was published in by William Morris in 1890, and this is a major text concerning the utopian socialism and science fiction. It's a fine blend of both utopian socialism and science fiction, and also a blend of Marxism and Romance tradition. So, in this, novel, Morris has this protagonist called William Guest, who falls asleep coming back from a meeting of a socialist league, only to wake up in a dreamy world which embodies the main traits of socialism and utopianism, like the common ownership, democratic means of production, means whatever is there produced in the society is produced democratically, and all the citizens have an equal right over the products produced in the society. So that society was utopian because it didn't have the private properties. All properties belong to all citizens. It didn't have prisons, courts, institutions like marriages and divorces both. Money economy is very important. So it's like a going back to the pre-industrial age, both in terms of having a barter economy in place, means exchange of goods. Barter economy means exchange of goods, economy based on the exchange of goods. I give you rice, you give me maybe some items made of iron. So these things, exchange system. So it's going back to the days of barter economy, and without class systems, which was the class became an important issue in post-industrial period. So it talks about such a utopian society. So it's kind of a looking back to the pre-industrial agrarian society. Another important point is it also talked about the life closer to nature, almost in the spirit of the romanticists of the previous age. It talks about nature, it talks about solace of walking, i- sitting in the lap of nature. And it didn't have the alienation of labor as well. Means the product was not cut off from the producer. I am producing rice and I'm giving this rice to you. I have an emotional attachment with whatever I have produced. But when money economy came, then it became price tagged. I buy a kg of a kilo of rice, a kilogram of rice with 30, 40, 50, 100 rupees. So rice no more remained rice, rice became price. So it also talks about camaraderie, uh, living in a commune, like it talks about a couple, Dick and Clara, and it also talks about emancipation of the working class representative called women representative called Ellen. So all this utopian socialism, all these traits of utopian socialism were discussed in this novel. This is why this is an important. This novel is an important literary piece related to avant-garde of 1890s. Then next is decadence. The picture of Dorian Gray is an published in 1890 that talked about decadence as a part and parcel of the avant-garde movement, in which it both talked about decadence or degeneration, which is a kind of a moral term, which is more about a conservative approach of looking at things, looking at the prevalent situation of the age. We do not treat this morally proper. This is why this is a sign of degeneration. So the hedonistic philosophy, or eat, drink, make merry, the philosophy of eating, drinking, making merry, only enjoyment and enjoyment without moral conscience. So that became a hallmark of what the conservatives termed as decadence as a part of the avant-garde of 1890s. So so decadence is one part of this novel. Another issue was aestheticism. It also talks about, not only talks about Dorian Gray, the man, but also talks about Dorian Gray's full-length portrait, in which the more Dorian Gray got absorbed in the hedonistic philosophy, the more the his picture, portrait, that got decayed. The moment Dorian the man kills himself, the picture, with all its youthfulness and beauty, that regains its originality. So it talks about the connection of art and life, aestheticism, and its connection with human life and culture. And not only a connection, but it also professes that art is something superior to the life, because only after Dorian Gray stabs himself in and he you know became decayed and aged and dead. On the contrary, the portrait, his portrait, a artwork, that became alive, that regained its original beauty. So it talked about the superiority of art to life. So this is why this is an important text on the decadence and aestheticism that was also a part and parcel of avant-garde in 1890s. Next is aestheticism, once again, of Walter Pater's appreciation, in Walter Pater's appreciations, with an essay on style, which was published in 1889 and which contained 11 essays as chapters. The first essay is Style, and the last titled as Postscript, and it talks about romantic poets and the romantic spirit of Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Charles Lamb. It is also an appreciation of Thomas Brown's Baroque style. Baroque is a kind of style in artistry or art or painting in which excessive use of color and lines is made so that the artwork becomes very prominent. So that Baroque style of Thomas Brown was appreciated by Walter Pater because it was also a characteristic of art for art's sake, and the autonomy of art. Art should dominate. So the colors and the lines should dominate as well, or rather, putting it in this way, that if lines and colors in an artwork or in a painting dominate, then artwork itself starts dominating over and above the artist. So autonomy and superiority of artwork to artists, that was also professed in this piece of aestheticism. Then Shakespeare's comedies of Love's Labour's Lost, Measure for Measure, they were also critically appreciated. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's poems, some poems were also appreciated. So basically, this talks about the an ongoing relevance, as far as Walter Pater was concerned, of the art for art's sake movement into the 1890s arts and literatures. Now, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, very, very famous, text, which almost is regarded as the earliest or one of the earlier signs of modernism. Many character traits of modernism are found in this novella, and these characters, as we have found out, were also responsible. I mean, these characters were of avant-garde arts and literatures, were also responsible for the modernism in arts and literatures to take place and to flourish. Like, for example, we all know that this is a journey of Marlowe to the heart of Africa along the Congo River, and his encounter, or his encounter with the story of Kurds, the ivory trader, and with the wild African people and landscape. I'm not going into the story, but what were the anti-conventional or newly experimented innovative styles that characterized this novel, that I'll be discussing in brief. The first is This is considered as one of the earliest modernist experimentation and innovation in novels or in literatures for that matter. This can be read as a critique of Western colonialism and disturbingly a realistic expose of the evils of Western colonialism. So, for the first time, we saw not a natural reception of colonialism, Western colonialism, by an Westerner. Rather, it was seen as a critique of colonialism. Also, the text is not almost free from the superior colonial gaze of the Westerners. So, the racial biases also remained in the text if closely read. This was also an example of psychological novel wherein the perception of the narrator that colors the meaning that is coming out of the narration. So it's the psychic pattern resulting in the production of meaning that is implied by this early one of the earliest examples of psychological novel. This was also a symbolic novel which narrates the mythic journey to hell and return. This is also a dark romantic quest into the hostile land of dangerous mysteries and forbidden wisdom. Complex narrative structure with open-ended, ironic, multi-layered, conclusive meaning production. All these are hallmarks of this text, and this is why this became very, very important major text of avant-garde in 1890s. And New woman is another issue that was there in 1890s. This was also kind of anti-establishment because this talked about the emancipation of women, not only the emancipation of women, but an emergence of a new kind of women with confidence, with who were thinking about sexual freedom, political consciousness, freedom for rational dressing at par with men, professional identity, among others. So all these characteristics of new women that were coming up in as a part of avant-garde thought processes and writings in 1890s as well. But Candida is even more subtle, as the protagonist Candida is, I think, even more powerful than the stereotype of new woman, as at least described in the Sarah Grant's article, The New Aspect of Women Question, published in 1894. Because Candida not only had the controls over her fate and choices, but also had strong rational pragmatic sense, which gave her the driver's seat, which did not let her to break the system, but at the same time take control over the system. So it is a reversal of the dynamics of the system, reversal of the patriarchy that was the essence of the character of her husband, but rather for the protection of that husband that she did not leave the family. So this is even stronger an indication of even a stronger version of feminism, I think, uh, which could balance between the romanticism of Eugene Marchbanks, which did not invalidate the romanticism of Eugene Marchbanks, the poet and the suitor, but at the same time, it did not break the conventional structures. Rather, Candida became the mistress of and the controller of the system. So it was even more important from that perspective. Jude the Obscure in 1895, that not only sparked controversies because of its unabashed description of the social condition and inequality, injustice inherent in the society, but also some highly volatile, at least from the point of view of society then, and I think even today, volatile sexual issues or issues related to sexuality. So Jude the Obscure was also termed by one of the critics as Jude the Obscene. And for the charge in the charge of obscenity, Hardy was very pained, and we know that he later diverted himself into writing poetry. So this is not only this takes not only tells us about the unhappy marriages, but also the within quotes illicit marriages, illicit relationships between Jude Foley and Sue Bridehead. It also complicates the matter of the tension between the morality and theology on one hand, and the freedom of breaking the received norms on the other. So the tension of between the marriage and divorce, the church and the anti-establishment spirit, that tension was there, that we noted here in this text. So in the conclusion, I'd like to cite this poem by Darkling Thrush by Thomas Hardy, in which this tension between pessimism and optimism, that's what made this age or this decade 1890s as something that made something turbulent, that became the hallmark of this age. It is one of the representative poems where, side by side, Hardy talks about the optimism and the pessimism of this age, the tension and the turbulence of this age. He is talking about a small bird, thrush, beyond the courtyard in a wintry night, chilly wintry night of his country home, and here in the second stanza, he talks about the century which was almost dead because it could not bear the tensions and the turbulence of the century. But in the fourth paragraph, it was full of hope. The fourth stanza is full of hope and optimism, that once again, this is kind of utopian idealism that is expressed, that is also a hallmark of Victorian poetry as well, that it ends generally with hope. So this hope is there in the in this part, in the last stanza. So I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. We in summary talked about the definition, then the theoretical discussions on avant-garde, then the parameters or the characteristics of avant-garde. Then we came to the historical, socio-political, cultural, historical developments in this decade, major literary publications of this age, and then some prominent ideas and the representative texts in which these ideas were elaborated as a part of the characteristic features of avant-garde of 1890s. So I hope I had conveyed some meaning to the, I could do justice to the title. Shoykot, Dr. Shoykot Banerjee, if you can take over.
Thank you,
You're most
Dr.
welcome.
Sovan.
Most welcome.
As usual, thank you very much for a very well-researched, concrete, very exhaustive, but very, very lucid presentation on this very, very important part in the history of English literature. And as was expected, and as I had already informed our participants, that we are here for a cerebral feast. Thank you very much for taking into account that our participants are graduate final semesters and MA first semesters. Our participants have very thoroughly enjoyed this wonderful session of yours. The testimony to the fact is a plethora of congratulatory messages that you can see on the chat screen.
Yeah,
And
I'm following.
as has been said, it's a very fluent and effective class, and thank you very much for that. Now, if I may ask the participants, if you have any questions, Dr. Shovan is a very, very serious scholar, and I happen to know him for a long period of time. So I can assure you, any question if you have, if it's a very simple question also you can ask, and he will, I'm sure he will put it in a very descriptive and critical manner as per his understanding and his approach to literature or critical analysis of literature is concerned.
I'll try my level best.
So, Dr. Shovan, if you may permit, I will put forward few questions as has been put forward by our participants.
Please do so, Dr. Banerjee.
The first question, as I said, this is a heterogeneous group, so we have graduate first year, second year also. So the first question is, can you just elaborate on antagonism a little bit?
See, the first moment of avant-garde or the evolution of avant-gardism from 18, I would like to say 70s onwards to the third and fourth decade of the 20th century is concerned, Renato is talking about four moments. The first is activism. But when we take an action, be it a planned action or a spontaneous action, here he is talking about the spontaneity in taking an action by an avant-garde artist or a literature or a writer for that matter. Then action will be taken favoring somebody, but action will also be against somebody. So the second moment is antagonism, or kind of opposition or apathy towards a particular group. Likewise, there is a sympathy. There is like standing by some group or some ideology. There is also taking an action or a stand against some group. So these groups are antagonistic groups that avant-garde artists took head on. And these groups were basically two groups. The first was the tradition, and the second group, or the followers of tradition, and the second group was, the mass, because mass, or the people in general, they are the propagator of the dominant tendencies or majoritarian principles that became the zeitgeist or the spirit of a particular age. So by antagonism, he meant who the avant-garde artists were against and who they tried to revolt against because of their ideological inclinations and their reception of the dominant tendencies of that particular age. I hope that explains my position.
Yes.
Rather, Renato's explanation of antagonism.
To add to that antagonism is another question. What is the difference between nihilism and agonism?
Yeah, nihilism and agonism both are psychological traits, but nihilism, and they are both negative traits. But nihilism is like related to, as I have already shown, that nihilism, let me go back to that particular slide, because I probably, as far as can see two definitions of nihilism and agonism. Nihilism and agonism both were psychological characteristics, but and both were destructive to some extent. This is why both were part and parcel of decadence. But nihilism was the essence. The essence of nihilism was the non-action yet acting. So I'm writing an a poetry, or a piece of poetry, but at the same time I can't take my ideology forward, or maybe I can't attain what I want to attain. So that destructive, frustration has a destructive effect on the psychology of whoever is writing. So that is nihilism. But agonism is also about tension. It's also about pathos, the spasms. And there is, if nihilism is purposeless, maybe agonism is a little bit more purposeful, because the poet is trying to make himself or herself immortal. But the the majoritarian trends of the structures of the establishment didn't let him or her do so. So that pathos, the pathos coming out of that condition, the spasm coming out of that, that condition, the impediments and the impossibility, the kind of defeatism in in an attempt to attain something transcendental, something spiritual, that gives rise to agony within a poet or a poetess, for that matter. I think this is the basic difference. Maybe something is more purposeful and planned, or maybe related to the aim of a poet or a poetess, but the second one is not. It's more of a spontaneous, it's about pathos, about negativity, if I can say so, if I can term it so. But this is about something more spontaneous. I don't know whether I could explain that, because more about on a philosophical and psychological plane. So yeah, but I tried.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Shogun. Next question is, in your opinion, uh, why the picture of Dorian Gray is classified as a decadence novel?
Because I think mainly if we go by the majoritarian reading of the novel, because of its association of hedonistic philosophy, and because of Dorian Gray's taking resort to several immoralities, that starts with his wish to remain ever youthful so that he could enjoy you know life to the fullest, but in all with but in indulging himself with all sorts of pleasure principles without taking heed to the moral responsibilities of the life. So I think there where the opposition between the character of Dorian Gray and the character of Candida lies, because Dorian Gray is both Dorian Gray and Candida, they were making a difference. They were against the prevailing tendencies of the age, the prevailing moralities. They wanted to change, like the avant-gardes themselves. They wanted to change the course of the society in different fields. But one, the Dorian Gray did it with degeneration and with immense negativity, whereas Candida remained superior as she did not break the system, yet took control of the system. So that was a bit superior approach that was in Candida. So I think the degeneration, as far as this immorality within court, once again, because these are all relative issues. It might not be immoral in today's times, or might be immoral to some people at today's times, not to some people of today's time. So it's all relative. But simply going along the dominant tendencies of the Victorian age and the Victorian morality, it was a kind of gothic novel. It was because even murders were, the murders took place in the novel. Uh, First, the Dorian Gray stabbed his girlfriend, the actress in Shakespearean plays. Then he stabbed himself in the end. So I think, but there is a positive aspect as well, uh, that the death of Dorian Gray immortalized his portrait, and brought back the beauty and youthfulness to that portrait. So the superiority of art was established, but the life was made inferior. So maybe the life of flesh and blood that made inferior, that led to this, uh, this interpretation of this novel as something of a piece of degeneration that was there in the picture of Dorian Gray.
Thank you, Dr. Shogun. We take the last question of the day.
Yeah.
Do you find any contradiction between the socialist agenda of the avant-garde artists and the ideology of art for art's sake expounded by some of them?
Uh, See, I think they are not in the same line. art for art's sake explicitly professed for the autonomy of the art. So it was publicly uh, proclaiming that art should not only be superior, but it should govern itself. The characteristics of art might not be governed by the characteristics of the masses for that matter, or the predominant conditions, socio-political, cultural conditions of some age for that matter. But although Marxism or socialism was against to, in many cases, at least the intellectual Marxism that was against, the taste and tendencies in masses, it always preferred to take the masses along, because communism or socialism talked about democracy, talked about social justice, talked about the like the core principle of Marxism, like the uh, superiority and the control of the working class masses. So theoretically, to some extent, practically, they took along masses. So they were in different lines. I don't think that aestheticism of Walter Pater, or for that matter, the pre-Raphaelite school, that was completely in consonance with the socialistic or Marxist tendency that colored the avant-garde movement of 1890s. But yes, as far as the absorption of the elitist intellectual by the bourgeois ideology is concerned, in that part, if we talk about the autonomy, not only of art but also of life or thinking is concerned, that was to some extent in consonance, might be to some extent in consonance with the art for art's sake. So if they were of not of the same lines, then I think contradiction is a little bit more extravagant word for considering these two ideologies.
Thank you, Dr. Shovan, for
Mhm.
so distinctly, clearly answering the questions and critically answering the questions as was
Uh,
expected from you.
I don't
And
know. I don't know what was the expectation, and I don't know whether I could, answer them at all discreetly or whatever in your terms. But yes, I tried my level best, and thank you very much. I'm seeing Basudhara, I think maybe a decade or what? I don't know. So I'm
It's
very
a
happy.
decade.
It's more than maybe a more than a decade, maybe. So I'm happy that that I could see all the virtually your faces after so long, and that is, I think, the biggest treasure that I'll take out of this conversation or interaction or whatever it is.
thank you, Dr.
And I'm
Shovan.
thankful to both of them for giving this
No,
opportunity.
actually, Basudhara is the lady, the brain behind this history of English literature course. She is the architect of this course, and she has designed it.
Yeah, the
And
pillars. I mean the chapters that showed that.
I'm just implementing it. She is the brain behind
Mhm,
this course, and
mhm,
uh, what a beautiful way to connect all of us
mhm,
participants. We belong from the same university. We studied, almost together, and
mhm,
good to see each other after a long time, and good to see Sovan teaching all of us again, once again, and.
mhm.
Thank you, Dr. Shobham, for
Ah,
agreeing and for extensively speaking on this topic, and truly justifying the aim and objective of our course, of our this particular course with which we had designed this course. So I would Now request Dr. Vasudhara to please convey the vote of thanks to our resource person, Dr. Sovan Chakraborty. Yes, I
Probably
have
Basu
asked
is
you to unmute. You have
yeah.
to unmute yourself. She's having a little bit of internet issue on her side today.
Mhm. Yeah, I could see that.
I just have to unmute. Yeah, I've given you the right. You can unmute. No.
Shovanda, for
Thank you.
consenting to be with us today. And as as it was informed to the audience, yes, I have had the privilege of watching both the scholars with whom I share today's platform, Sekada and Shovanda. I have had the privilege of watching them in the making as scholars. And I feel so proud that they have justified the training that was imparted to all of us by a very rich faculty of teachers. And we are very, very grateful, Shobhita, that you consented to be with us here
My
today.
pleasure.
And you
My
spoke,
pleasure.
as one of the messages testified, that you illuminated an age which was largely very hazy, because it is an age which is not usually discussed in classrooms. It is usually taken within the fold of the Victorian era. So nobody discusses the turbulent 1890s independently. We usually have it, some of it squeezed into the discussion of the Victorian era, and sometimes we have back references to it when we are, discussing modernism. So nobody, as such, focuses the spotlight on this particular age and talks about it as a crucible from where modernism emerged. Not just modernism, but I believe even postmodernism takes off from the key ideas which was, generated in the crucible of the 1890s. So it was
Absolutely.
an important objective of this lecture series, that we draw light and we introduce the students and the participants to this particular era, so that they can explore the importance of it for themselves. And I believe that you have given them the big push which will motivate them to go back to this particular age, to take up books and to read them in the light of what you have told them. So thank you very much for doing a wonderful job today, and we are all very,
Thank you.
very grateful to it. Thank you so much.
I'm so humbled by such a nice conclusion. Generally, there are introductions, but the conclusion is so nice that I must be made humbled. Fine. Thank you very much, Shoikota and Basudhara, and all of you who are present here. And the architects are there to comment on whether the mansion is properly erected or not. And I'll be very happy if I can get some feedback from the participants as well later on, obviously, whether they could be benefited from whatever I discussed today. So thank you very much once again.
Definitely, Shovan. As I said, that the participants are highly benefited. They have thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. The testimony to the fact are the plethora of congratulatory messages which are there in the chat box. And yes, tomorrow again we meet at 6:30, and one more very young, erudite, dynamic scholar, Dr. Amitabh Chakraborty, will be teaching us tomorrow from 6:30. Don't miss the class tomorrow also. We are in for cerebral treats now. So yes, once again, Dr. Shovan, thank you. Participants, thank you. Take very good care of yourself. Good night, and see you tomorrow, 6:30. Bye, Vasudhara. Thank you.
Good night.